Welcome to a new edition of Are You Live, featuring very special guest, old friend, fan favorite, hero to most of the world. Can't even speak. I'm so starstruck by you. The great Kmele Foster, who is beaming in live from his underground bunker in rural Virginia. I think you have firearms all around you, which you're not willing to show on video. Is this correct?
A few guns.
You have your wife and baby daughter in the safe room.
Yeah. We were actually at my mother-in-law's place, so she's here as well as my dog, who is newly injured. But what else is new? Always some medical malady with him. But yeah, no, we've got plenty of ammunition, plenty of food and supplies, well stocked, lots of toilet paper, lots of paper towels. We're in pretty good shape.
So do not roll up on Kmele and his family, because he's ready for you if you want to try to.
Yeah, we've got what you want, as they say in the streets. We're heavy on the hip and we stay outside.
If you're trying to get some easy toilet paper, do not go there.
No, this isn't the place. We got that smoke.
That's right. All right. So you've been talking a lot of stuff about this thing we're going through. I've been listening to you.
Oh my gosh. Well, who isn't talking about this?
I'm trying to, well, I know, but like, first of all, can we not talk about race for an hour and a half? Is that possible?
I'm fine with that.
Good. And I especially don't want to talk about, what's her name? What's her name? 1619?
Oh, Nicole Hannah-Jones.
I definitely don't want to talk about Nicole Hannah-Jones, who wrote a series of tweets. I'm going to talk about it. What was it, 2 days ago? This was like,
maybe yesterday.
This maybe the most amazing, stupidest moment in a very amazing, stupid series of events in American history, in which she said that the Michigan because there were like 3 Confederate flags, or was it even that many? 1 Confederate flag.
In the images that she posted and the video, there was only 1 Confederate flag.
Right.
Lots and lots of people. Right. 1 Confederate flag
at the Michigan protest to reopen the economy in Michigan. And Michigan's had like the most draconian lockdown of all the states, I think. She said, I swear to God, she said that it was because data had just come out showing that blacks were overrepresented in the cases and in the deaths attributed to coronavirus. And so, I mean, she didn't straight out say this, but she was saying that people were calling for an end of the lockdown in order to harm black people. Correct?
Yeah. I mean, she pretty much explicitly said that. Yeah. If you think that it's a coincidence that this data related to the black overrepresentation in coronavirus deaths and infections, that it's any coincidence that data came out and now these people are in the streets protesting, you don't know this country very well. And that is obviously ridiculous. I mean, a single Confederate flag, a protest consisting of hundreds and hundreds of people, and economic conditions such as they are in the United States, tens of millions of people newly unemployed, millions more who appropriately are concerned that they might be next. And many of them likely will be next. And she thinks these people are motivated by racism. It's obscene, but I suspect some of it is just self-preservation. And in the same way that all of us feel a great deal of anxiety and uncertainty about what's going on, we're not sure how this will affect us. I certainly have I'm an entrepreneur. I've got a company to run and a lot of people to try to keep employed. I think she's probably nervous. There hasn't been much interest in the things that she's selling right now, right?
Oh, right. And
so you got to find a way.
So she was claiming not just that people were motivated by racism, but by like mass homicidal racism. That like, right? Like the reason they wanted the lockdown to end was to kill as many black people as they could, and this was the way to do it. Like,
or at least you don't care anymore, right? Like before you were nervous, and now it's like, well, it's mostly killing the black people. Okay. Like, why do we care?
Even though just like with mass incarceration, as you and I well know, like there's still more white people being affected by the thing. So it's a hell of a collateral damage for racists to undergo, right?
Well, I don't know if you caught that we ended up engaging a little bit, which is unusual
She
because
come
she
back at
usually
you?
won't. And she posted something in response to me, and she made fun of me for being articulate, which is, I mean, this is astonishing. New
Wow.
York Times magazine contributor.
Wow.
The actual post was Confederate flags. Um, something about let me find it here.
Share your
Yeah,
screen.
that's why. Yes, that's why there were. I got a different. It's my iPad, so I don't
Okay.
type while I'm talking to you all because that's
Gotcha.
distracting. But it says, yes, that's why there were flying Confederate flags, and why none of the protesters were black, even though black people are the most economically vulnerable. You used big words, all the big words you learned in college, and still did not manage to say a damn thing. Have a good one. That's nice punctuation. Um, of course, I mean, if you follow the logic there, right? Like once these monstrous white people who want to open the economy because of their disregard for black people realize that opening the economy benefits black people more than white people,
Mm.
then what will they do? What will they do when they find themselves in this catch 22?
Why would it
I
benefit
don't
black
know.
people more?
Because black people are the most economically vulnerable. So
Oh, right.
keeping the economy closed is obviously worse for them.
That's right. The rich are doing okay.
This is, it's insane.
Yeah, this is beyond. Now, for those who don't know, I mean, we're not picking on some internet troll here. We're picking on the person who was responsible for the 1619 project at the New York Times. I don't know what her position is at the Times, but she's like one of their editors now, right? Isn't she like on the staff
Yeah, she works for the magazine. Yeah.
for the magazine, New York Times Magazine? Yeah, which I used to work for, but way back in the day in the 1990s. I had a gig at the magazine for a year, but so this is like a major journalist now, unfortunately. But to say something like that is just unbelievable. Let's do a quick show of hands. Who believes that ending the lockdown, wanting to end the lockdown, is racist? Yeah, okay. Good. So, are you like just one of these totally irresponsible anarchists who think we should just uh, blow open the doors and let it rip and end the lockdown totally tomorrow? Should there be no government
I'm
involvement
not
at
an
all? Come on.
I'm not an irresponsible anarchist. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. In truth, I probably occupy space between Nozick and Rothbard, so minimal state. I'm also a pragmatist. So speaking as a pragmatist and not so much those other things, I think some sort of mitigation effort, perhaps even state-run mitigation effort, is totally reasonable to begin with. Um,
Hmm.
but it seems to me that if you're going to do something like that, it ought to be time delimited, like very explicitly. And you ought not be able to go over that without some pretty extraordinary approval process. For the most part, what we have is executive branches all over the country unilaterally making decisions to force all of their citizens to stay inside. And in many other cases, like in Michigan, prohibiting them from being able to buy various things. This is a pretty extraordinary exercise of power. And they have subsequently been extending these lockdowns for additional periods. Quite honestly, it seems that they could do this indefinitely without any sort of break on those kinds of limitations on people's liberties. And at this point, you have seen interdictions taking place where people are being prohibited from worshiping, where a protest is broken up on the street and people are told that protesting essentially is not an essential activity. So it is now prohibited because of the quarantine. It does seem to me that all of these things are one in excess of what is likely to actually keep people safe. So then the impetus for doing it is wrong. But two, just from a practical standpoint, not necessarily the best approach to try to address this. I mean, if what we know at this point to be true, and I think it's fair to say we do know it, that the most vulnerable populations are people of a certain age who have particular comorbidities. In New York City, it does seem that obesity is actually the number one comorbidity to go along, comorbidity for someone to have that would make them likely to be hospitalized and potentially die. Then it seems like we know which populations are likely to be the most vulnerable, and perhaps those people ought to stay home and stay as safe as possible and take additional precautions. But for the rest of us, it doesn't seem at all absurd for us to be able to try and harden ourselves, be a bit more resilient, to look at the facilities that we run, the stores that we run, and find ways to make those places more secure. And in my own experience, like when I'm going around here in Virginia and I do go to the supermarket or the drugstore, I've been astonished to see the speed with which folks are adapting to the new normal. Like the postings on the floor that make it very obvious, hey, this is 6 feet, this is 6 feet, this is 6 feet. And it's the sort of stuff that I see everywhere. It's not just the big retail chains, it's the small restaurants that still happen to be open, which have completely closed down the inside, so you can't sit in there because they don't want people to congregate. All of the staff have gloves on and masks, and they take extra precautions. They're bringing food out to people. In this last week, I've had my dog groomed. I took him to the vet. I've like picked up dinner for the family. And I've done all of these things and grocery shopped twice. And I've done all of these things. I don't know how many fingers I just held up, but it's twice. And I've done all of these things. And I don't think I've put anyone at risk. Everyone is wearing masks. Everyone's taking precautions. And to the extent you're not taking precautions, the police don't need to get involved. There's actually an extraordinary amount of social pressure going on. People see me outside and I'm not wearing a mask and they start to freak out. And granted, I think there is almost certainly a level of undue alarm amongst some of us, but that's fine so long as it's personal, private citizens sort of taking actions and doing things on their own. And if there are going to be excesses in that regard, then that's fine. They've decided that. But just as people are very, very comfortable with doctors taking risks on the front line out there, bravely sort of fighting to save people's lives, I think it would behoove us to have a similar sort of respect for the people who say, you know what, I'm not content to just sit here. Like, I want to fight back. And fighting back in some respects is trying your very damnedest to live your life, to keep your business open, to continue to provide for your family, and to do it in as safe and sensible a way as possible, so that you're protecting yourself and your family and your neighbors. Like, we don't want to make one another sick. We don't want to do things to endanger one another, but we also don't want to induce perhaps like decade-long depression. That would be ruinous. And not enough people appreciate that. And that is a bit astonishing to me, but I think that is changing. I certainly think that, you know, salaries getting frozen at universities, newspapers starting to have to cut back on their staffs. That's changing things. All these folks who thought they could work from home indefinitely, and this is fine, seeing that that's not necessarily the case under circumstances like this. So
you just summarized my position perfectly. But you kind of,
which we haven't even talked about. So I'm not shocked by this, but we haven't talked about this.
I know we haven't. Well, that's because we have mind meld. We always have. No, but you're kind of, well, you did mention it at the beginning of what you were saying there. I mean, but this kind of elides the question that a lot of people I'm sure have for you, and they have for me and people like us, which is, so what exactly should the government be doing? What should it have done? What is the role of government? Like, you said something like it should have, you know, it was appropriate, even speaking as an anarcho-capitalist, for the government, the state, to do something here. But I'm not sure what it should be, because so here's our experience out in the Bay Area. You know, you may know this, but like the Bay Area was the very first place in the whole country to order to do shelter in place order, right? And we also have lower rates of infection here. But there's also been basically no enforcement. And in fact, the mayors of all the cities in the Bay Area announced the day of the shelter in place order that they would not enforce it. So, and then enforcement, we talked about this with Katie Herzog on Tuesday night. I mean, there have been some horrible, egregious examples of enforcement of this across the country, but very, very few, considering it's essentially a national law, right?
I've been shocked, honestly.
Yeah, very, very little enforcement of this, and basically a non-enforcement in most of the country, and yet we've already flattened the curve, right? And all the things that you've been talking about have been going on voluntarily. Clearly, I think people have masks on not because they're afraid of the police, because no one's going to get busted for having a mask on. They're wearing it for the reasons you just stated. So I think that basically it's been mutual aid has flattened the curve, not the law. I mean, you know,
I think that's right.
and by the way, there was just today, what did I see? 70% of open table orders are reservations, or open table was reduced by 70% of its reservations, like the day before the lockdowns went into
Right.
place.
Yeah.
And something like, and some poll came out today on Bloomberg, I think it said 90% of Americans are following the orders or regardless of the law or something like that. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what the government did to help this at all. And by the way, the tests and any vaccines that we need are not going to come from the government. They're going to come from our favorite corporations, big pharma, you know, but still, you know.
They might. I mean, this is one, I think we're in the middle of this, and I think it's enormously complicated. One thing that I came to realize pretty early on was whether or not COVID-19 is, the most devastating virus imaginable. This was back when people were saying that it's got like a 3.4% fatality rate, which is obviously astronomically too high. Now we know this. I was very concerned about the risk of a global pandemic, and I am newly aware and understand much better the degree to which this is something that we ought to be better prepared for, and we ought to be more thoughtful about. And after all of this is over, I think that we need to have a global conversation, and I'm not talking about governments per se, I mean everyone, about how we can prepare for this, because it does seem to me that the things that are most important in terms of getting through this well, and there will be a time later when we actually have an opportunity to look at results from all over the world and assess this stuff, but it's the culture of a particular place, it's the degree to which the citizens actually take the threat seriously, because there's a sense in which these shelter in place, stay in your home policies can't actually be enforced. To the extent most Americans disregard these rules and don't actually regard the threat as serious, there aren't enough jail cells in America to deal with this. There aren't enough police officers in America to deal with this. This is only succeeding because Americans are willing to stay home. And that is an important thing to underscore. And I think that is, in a very real sense, the most important lesson here, that it's not the government that's saving us in this particular instance. We're saving ourselves. But what I think official institutions can do is be a clearinghouse for sound advice. Unfortunately, throughout the pandemic, there have been many instances where they simply have not been that. They have actually given erroneous advice, potentially harmful advice. The advice with respect to masks early on, where we were told that you don't need a mask can't actually protect you, when in fact it obviously can. And it seems that their goal was to really make certain that the masks were available for particular categories of person. And I'm going on a bit, but I do want to say one other thing. I do think there's a role for some sort of international cooperation as well. And I know this week, President Trump decided that he's no longer going to, at least for the time being, while we investigate some things, fund the World Health Organization. And I think the profound failure of the World Health Organization is something that really can't be understated. Well, anything can be, but it's important not to understate it. It's been a complete debacle in ways that are deeply disturbing, and that organization, something like it ought to exist. It's not clear who should fund it, but that particular institution should almost certainly be burned to the ground and replaced by something else. And that's not to say that this is the best time to do it, but it is deeply corrupt and completely inadequate to the task of safeguarding the planet. And obviously, they are at this point under the thumb of the Chinese government and have been essentially accessories to their attempts to deflect blame, to dodge the responsibility that they have in all of this, and to protect the Chinese economy, and particularly the Communist Party of China. So it's a pretty deplorable track record.
Jesus. Okay, so I didn't know. I didn't know that much about the WHO, the World Health Organization, on this stuff. So can you lay out the case a little bit better before why it should be burned to the ground?
Well, the short version is, if we actually look at what took place here, the World Health Organization got involved in the situation in sort of February, December. They have
Wait, February
since,
or wait, which month?
I'm sorry, I said February, December. I'm sorry, December. In December,
Okay.
it I believe is when they got involved.
Right.
But since that time, there have been numerous occasions where they have characterized the response of the Chinese government as laudable and wonderful, and something that the rest of the world ought to emulate. And it's worth mentioning that the Chinese government's response is, I mean, thick with human rights violations. It's essentially a fraudulent exercise where they've reported what are obviously dodgy numbers about the number of cases and infections that are there. They've profoundly understated it, almost certainly understated the number of deaths, continually reporting that they have had no deaths except for filthy foreigners who are visiting the country with coronavirus, which apparently, who knows where they got that. And they were reporting early on, after they had information to the contrary, that there was no human-to-human transmission, that this was not a thing that they knew to be possible. They were reporting that sort of stuff as some of their representatives in Hong Kong who were in contact with doctors who were working in China were telling them the exact opposite. They, for a very long time, actually until fairly recently, were still suggesting that there was no asymptomatic transmission, which is among the most important characteristics of COVID-19. It's one of the things that makes it so very difficult for us to control, because if you are asymptomatic and you are carrying this disease around and actually giving it to other people, you have absolutely no idea. And because there's been a lack of supply of tests and a general disposition in amongst the CDC and various other governments not to test people who don't have particular symptoms and meet particular criteria, we simply don't have a very good idea how many people in our population are infected. So the World Health Organization has helped to perpetuate like all of those dangerous circumstances, and along the way, again, has played a lot of offense for, or at least defense for, the Chinese government. One defense that's often been offered for the World Health Organization is to say, well, the World Health Organization is a non-political organization and they have to do business with a lot of dastardly characters, including China. So you can't expect them to be critical of Beijing. But what the World Health Organization has done is been explicitly critical of other governments, including the United States. They were critical of the travel ban that the United States instituted early on, saying there's no good reason for the United States to prevent people from China from coming to the United States, and this is only likely to be the sort of thing that creates xenophobia. And they've also gone so far as to criticize the government of Taiwan and suggest that there is a racist campaign being carried out against the leader of the World Health Organization, who himself is a total fraud, who it seems in his past may have been a party to covering up actual outbreaks in his home country. So there's a deep reservoir of misdeeds that ought to be accounted for and better understood. But I mean, I think the fact that that's something that needs to be dealt with is quite obvious. And honestly, like, until the president decided to get involved and specifically decided to take their money away, the week prior to that, all of the news had been about just how awful the World Health Organization was, that they had specifically ignored guidance that they received from Taiwan about the coronavirus because it was coming from Taiwan. Guidance that suggested, again, as I mentioned earlier, that the transmission was happening person to person in that particular case. So there's a lot there.
That's a devastating critique. I haven't heard most of that. Thank you. But here's the question I have. What's the motivation? Why are they in the pocket of the Chinese government?
Likely bribery. That'd be my guess. The
Okay.
United States government gives far more money to the World Health Organization. I think it's like tenfold than the Chinese do. But the Chinese are not not it is not beneath them to bribe people to line their pockets.
Oh,
And if the
you think
wrong
it's like,
sort of people are in position of power, then they can absolutely exercise a profound degree of control over institutions like this. And look, the Chinese government, I've developed a deep and abiding hatred for the Communist Party of China. It's something that I suppose I've always had, but that's gotten much more intense as a result of the time I spent in Hong Kong fairly recently.
hmm,
Um, they really are, and it can't be said enough, a threat to human freedom and human rights like the world over. It is one of their fundamental goals to redefine concepts like free speech and free
hmm.
press, because those ideals, those values are anathema to them. They are actually a threat to their power. So it's important that we know who we're dealing with. And I still think economic engagement is appropriate. I still think trade opens doors. There's been a lot of talk recently about how our project to liberalize China through economic intercourse has failed. I don't think that's completely true. I don't think that it's failed completely. But I do think it's worth us having our eyes open about the genuine threat that's posed by the Chinese, and the degree to which, in some respects, like certain kinds of awful things that you would have expected would actually resonate more with the international community, like the actual human slavery that's taking place with respect to the Uyghurs and their systematic mistreatment in China. I mean, the fact that a company like Nike can discover that it's very likely that slave labor is being used to assemble some of their shoes and their apparel, and it doesn't have the sort of repercussions that you might expect it to socially. I think that's a problem, and that's something that we ought to be talking about more, and people who care about those values should do more to amplify the level of concern around those issues.
All right. Now, I'm getting upset with you, right?
I don't know. Are you?
Yeah, a little bit.
I'm
So
sorry.
making it sound, I mean, look, I hate the Chinese Communist Party as much as you do. Okay.
Good.
Of course. Of course. Um, but you sounded like you were making the claim that they have imperialist ambitions for the rest of us, for the rest of the world outside
It's
of
not
their orbit.
imperialist.
Okay.
It's not imperialist.
Okay.
But they do want to erode norms, international norms that have become established principles. It is a good thing that around the world there is a basic consensus around this notion of human rights and certain notions of basic human dignity. To the
Hmm.
extent they're consistent with my notions of negative liberty, I think those are very, very good things, and that makes me happy. Um, the Chinese have done their best to not merely advance sort of an alternative view, but to try and redefine some of those concepts, like through their role in the UN's Human Rights Council. Like that is precisely the sort of stuff that they've been trying to do for many, many, many years.
Okay.
And they're actively trying to stomp out countries like that are effectively within their sphere of influence in some respects, or just in their geographic region, like Taiwan. And Hong Kong obviously is in a very unique spot, but Hong Kong has been historically one of the freest places on earth. And that is almost certainly not going to be the case anymore if things continue on the trajectory that they're on.
Okay. Let me give um, my rejection of what you say about human rights.
Okay.
And then I want to open it up to other people's questions. Does everyone know how to raise their hand electronically? You hover, am I right? You hover your mouse over your name and then you click on hand raise. Is that right? And Landry, give me a thumbs up. Is that correct? Okay. So raise your hand if you have a question for Kmele or me, or just want to comment or talk, because this is not just a Q&A. I think it is not has not been a good thing that human rights, that term, that concept has been a universal standard, which it has been only since World War II. So there's a lot of, actually, I'm not the only person to argue this. In fact, a lot of liberal scholars have been making this claim for a while, that human rights as a concept was invented and deployed by the United States right after World War II and placed in the UN Charter. And then it became the primary justification for every single American military intervention since. So if you look at from Korea to Guatemala, to Iran, to Vietnam, to Iraq and Afghanistan, the so-called violation of human rights in those places was the primary justification for the military invasions of those places. And so Samuel Moyn he's at Harvard. I mean, he's written books about this. Many people, Heidi Matthews has been on this show, been on Unregistered before. She makes this argument as well. It's not so good. It was one government essentially establishing an always ready pretext for military intervention and for the extension of its own hegemony worldwide. Sorry, but I will absolutely say, of course, down with the Chinese, down with the CCP, of course. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party's got to go. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But you're starting to talk a little bit like Michael Moynihan, and it's scaring me.
Well, look, I said this to someone the other day. It was certainly not on the podcast, but I'll say it in this context now, which I guess we said we're putting us on YouTube, so now it'll be out there in the wild. Yeah. It's certainly the case that hanging out with those guys all the time has some impact on me. But I'm not desperate for a conflict with the Chinese. Thad, I guess the one quick rejoinder to you, and I'd love for you to respond to it so it's not the last word on this, because I suspect you have some sort of answer, is if the principle is good, right? The notion that people have self-ownership, that their governments ought not be able to murder and imprison them without, murder them at all and imprison them without due process, et cetera. Having these norms, these ideals be established so that they can be advanced and defended, not necessarily with military interventions, but just in general, seems like a very good thing. And to the extent people use that as a pretense for military interventions abroad, it's not obvious to me that the norm is the problem versus this tendency to go places with tanks and drones or whatever else you want.
Right.
If not for those standards, it's possible that they would invent some other reason to go and invade these places.
Yeah.
So I share your concern about that category of action, but I'm not certain I'm there with you yet on the general concern about there being these notions of human rights that are advanced and defended somewhere. Whether or not that should be the UN Human Rights Council is another thing entirely. Right. And I suspect we might reach similar conclusions on that.
Right.
But
yeah, I mean, okay, so the norms of staying 6 feet away from other people and wearing a mask in public are good. We agree. Right? The problem we also agree is with the law enforcing those norms, right? And so it's the same. Okay. It's the same thing we're talking about here, right? There's the norm of human rights, sure, that that free speech is good, and that political dissidents shouldn't be thrown in prison, et cetera. That women should be allowed to wear whatever they want to wear, et cetera. All those things. Yeah, you and I, we like those norms. I like those norms. I wish that those norms were universal. I support them, but I don't want the government, the state, the law to enforce them. In this case, the United States of America with its military, which is what it would require. It's not just the local cop, which is bad enough, in the case of the virus, but when you're talking about enforcing universal global norms, it's got to be the superpower with its super military enforcing it, and it's going to require actual invasions of countries and lots of bloodshed to enforce those norms. That's been proven. I mean, you're not going to get all of the Middle East to reject Sharia law without that, right? You're not going to get China. You're not going to get China anytime soon at least, to adopt our versions of human rights. I mean, eventually I think the people will, without sending in the 82nd Airborne, right? So
I don't know about that. I mean, I think the one thing that gives me some hope is it's certainly the case that, 1989, like you have 1989 is Tiananmen Square.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. 1989, you have Tiananmen Square. um, 2000, when was the handover of Hong Kong? That was 2000,
97.
1997?
Landry.
Do I have my years
Landry
screwed
knows.
up? I don't know.
It's
But
97.
thank you, Landry.
Yeah, he knows.
Yeah.
Okay.
Since then, the pro-democracy movement has been growing in Hong Kong. And while the Chinese government has done all manner of dastardly things in Hong Kong, they have been reluctant to send in the People's Liberation Army. They have undermined their court system. They're doing all sorts of unbelievably dastardly technocratic things. They're trying to hollow their institutions out from the inside, but they're not sending in tanks. And I think a lot of that is a consequence of the economic harm that would come to them if they were to go in and do this, the recriminations that they might suffer from various international entities of which they enjoy their membership. They want to be a part of the World Health Organization. They want to be a part of the World Trade Organization. They want to be a part of the UN and the UN Human Rights Council. If they were to go in and just curb stomp Hong Kong, which they could do, right? There would be a global outcry. And I don't know that there would be a war, but that pressure is sufficient to give them some space. And with that space, they've used it to activate global concern and to grow it and to nurture it. And protests that began with tens of thousands of people now are like millions of people in the street at the same damn time. And I think that can only happen because of these ideals essentially being enshrined in these various bodies. And I think it is symbolic of the right way to do things without getting the 82nd Airborne involved.
See, that's an awesome argument, which I might even steal from you.
You should.
But it's an argument for international trade. Right. And
yeah,
it's an argument in
sure.
this case, and in particular here with China, trade with China, like the more trade, the better, because it also, I hadn't even thought of this until you just said it just now. That's why it's good, but you're not really supporting your own argument, because it gives the power to global consumers, right, to affect their internal politics rather than to governments, right? As consumers, we can now place pressure on China to do things.
I wish we would. Yeah, I wish
we can. We can boycott. We have the power to boycott them, right? So that's why trade, and it's yet another reason why trade with China is a good thing. So it's a great argument. It's not Michael Moynihan's argument, which is good. Or a neocon argument. So I like that, Kmele. All right.
I don't know. I think he's moving more in my direction too. It's not all one way, but I think so.
All right. I hope so. All right. We do have a couple hands raised. We'll take those and then we'll go to the private session after that. So Rob, you're up.
Okay, I've unmuted it. I was just wondering, to what extent do you think the government's declarations has had an effect on how people think about this? Because one of the things I keep on hearing, especially from libertarians, is that at this point, if we were to try to reopen the economy, nothing would really change. People are terrified of getting it, and so they're going to social distance on their own. At most, you would have some private innovations where maybe people go to a restaurant with like 20% capacity, stuff like that, but not much would change to get the economy cooking. Do you think that's because of institutions like the CDC and the FDA and stuff like that? Just they still, despite what polls say, have a level of public trust? Or maybe, I don't know what the polls say, I just assume everybody doesn't trust anything. But I'm just imagining, like in a libertarian or an anarchist society, I'm not sure if you would have institutions that got quite as much universal or as close to universal respect. So that's my question.
Great question.
I think you definitely would have institutions that carry that sort of respect. Brands do it all throughout society. And those brands in some cases are brands like the CDC. In other cases, it's, the Better Business Bureau. People have a level of respect for certain companies and entities. Bill Gates is a brand. Bill Gates goes out and he talks about the pandemic and the vaccine, the need for vaccines and the need for particular kinds of investments and how long the lockdown should last. And there are plenty of people who believe it because he says it. And I think that's something that will exist no matter what. I also would definitely agree, and there's plenty of evidence, I think Thad alluded to this earlier as well, that if in fact most of these prohibitions disappeared tomorrow, people would still be exceptionally cautious. And I think that's appropriate in many cases, and they ought to be. But that is a great argument for getting rid of the prohibitions, at a minimum, beginning to loosen them. This is the pragmatist talking, so that people can have an opportunity to fight, to save their businesses, to see if there's a way for them to keep operating despite the level of concern, to inspire confidence in their neighbors who are their customers, to come into their shops and to just begin to live life again. So
Can I respond to that real quick, or should I wait for the extra session?
please
Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. But the worry I have is this: the reason I think you agree that the reason they followed the prohibitions in the first place is precisely that they respect those institutions. If the institutions, or if the governors, let's just say, said, you know what, we're lifting all these restrictions, don't you think then people might think, hey, maybe it's safer than I thought? Like, after all, these institutions.
It's possible some people will say that. My expectation, though, is that when the governors say that, like, it's important to note that when people talk about getting back to normal, no one actually means that we're going back to normal the way it was before these things were enacted. We won't get there for a very long time, if ever. I think people would be cautious because those same governors would encourage people to exercise caution, and you would see that those messages of caution all over the place. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the social enforcement of particular kinds of standards and norms is something that is going to happen and evolve all on its own. Is it possible that governments have more respect than the competing private entities that might exist in kind of Camille's minarchist paradise would? Maybe, but I don't know that people respect their governments that much. The president of the United States does press conferences every single day, and more than half of America completely hates him and doesn't believe anything he says. They're willing to believe all manner of conspiracy theories about the man, that he's making billions of dollars selling pharmaceuticals, despite the fact that he owns maybe $300 worth of stock. Like, that's the level of credibility the government has. And to the extent people are able to sustain their faith in the CDC, in a lot of cases, it's because they're ignoring the various ways that CDC got this hella wrong, like, throughout. And in some cases, it's because it's a novel pandemic and we just don't have all of the facts right away. But Fauci, who everyone loves, like, they've been having this conversation for the past 2 weeks now about, well, if we'd acted a couple of days earlier or a couple of weeks earlier, how many lives would have been saved? This is Jake Tapper talking to Fauci. I guess he forgets that Fauci was the guy who was advising the president and who was specifically looking for evidence of community spread before he was willing to advise the president that we should lock the economy down. Like, he was there. He was part of the decision-making process. To the extent there was a failure, you can blame Donald Trump, but you should probably blame Fauci too, at least to the extent you believe that's the failure.
Yep. Oh, I have a question for Rob, actually. So, speaking of at least large portions of the economy never going back to normal, as Camille said, right? Rob, you're a professor at a state university. Are you one of the California states, right?
Yep. California State University, Northridge.
Northridge, yeah, right. So what's going on with Cal State Northridge?
I can tell you, maybe we should wait until the private session.
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, I just don't know if I'll get in trouble if I say, but I have heard predictions that, from whom I'm not going to say, but the predictions are significant drops in enrollment.
Yep.
And also the semester being virtual for next semester. And then beyond that, people aren't really willing to speculate because it's just so much can happen but between now and then. But you even hear conversations among faculty saying that we should purposefully do a bad job teaching online because we don't want students to think that online can be as good as face-to-face, right?
You would never do anything like that. I'm trying to help you out.
No, of course I would never do anything like that. Unfortunately, I've read Brian Kaplan's Case Against Education.
Yep.
When it first came out, and also before, actually. And I looked at I didn't trust him, so I looked up his data, and it checked out. So like I became very disillusioned with my own profession after that. Not because, I mean, for systemic reasons, but more just pedagogically, like how do you teach, period? Like how does teaching ever work? It's very difficult to figure out how. But this is really going far afield from what y'all were saying. Although I did find it interesting that you brought up Fauci's approval rating. He's been changing his mind a lot. Fauci's over 80%. The media changes their mind a lot. They're at 44%. Trump changes his mind a lot. I think he's either at 49 or 59%. So like, although everybody keeps on saying things, there's something about the manner where people trust that Fauci's intentions are genuine, and they don't trust that about the media or Trump. But they trust Trump more than the media.
Fauci's a man of science. That's what it is.
Well, he also is willing to admit ignorance about stuff. He doesn't strike me. I mean, I find him trustworthy, just in his manner. I don't have enough knowledge to like know whether or not he's a hack or a political operative or what. But he doesn't seem to be saying stuff out of line with people like Lipsitch or people like Gottlieb or Carl Bergstrom or, you know, a bunch of epidemiologists who seem to me to be conducting themselves rather well. But
I think he's sincere, and he seems to want to get it right. I don't think he's a political operative either. One thing about those approval ratings, though, is there at this point it's a food fight. Like it is a tribal, partisan food fight, and the president's approval rating is all people who love the president, and the media's approval ratings, for the most part, to the extent we're not talking about Fox News or what the hell is that other network, the crazy one with the crazy lady?
OAN.
Them too. No, OAN.
Oh.
Like to the extent it's not them, for the most part, they are vehemently against the president of the United States. So it's all tribal, you know. I don't know. Yeah. I think that's a point in my favor when it comes to sort of credibility and institutions.
Can we just go back to my Schadenfreude about higher education's crisis? Let me just say this. I'm going to make a prediction. So before the pandemic, many colleges and universities, not universities, many colleges had been shutting down over the last 3 or 4 years. There was already a major crisis in higher education, in large part because of the bubble created by the federal loan program, but for many other reasons as well. This is going to destroy, I am pretty sure, large sections of the higher education industry in this country. I think by the end of next academic year, a lot of colleges that we know will no longer exist. Rob, the good news is that there are upstart universities that, are largely, have been doing online learning already, and we're ready for this pandemic and are going to flourish as a result of it. So I'm just saying, there will be jobs in places like, like for instance, Renegade University, just off the top of my head here, for people like you, for brilliant independent scholars who actually can teach and actually are thinkers and actually should be teaching in higher education. So I'm not worried about people like you, but if I were a typical professor, most of whom have not much to say and aren't very good teachers, I'd be shitting my pants because many of them are going to be losing their jobs very soon.
Yeah, speaking just as somebody who's got a stake in this, I hope you're right. And I hope a lot of universities do close, even if that means I lose my job, because I'm not sure if the way things are structured, I can do my job well, just based on the systemic incentives.
That's right. We got to make our own universities now.
No expectation of massive bailouts for higher education?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you
seems like the sort of thing that would be politically popular.
That's how you ruined my morning the other day when we were talking on the phone. You reminded me that they'll probably try to bail them out. Yeah, there'll be bailouts.
I can imagine AOC's speech right now.
Oh, totally.
I can already hear it.
It is just disgusting that we allow universities to close in this country when billionaires. Something like that. Yeah. There will be a bailout, but it won't be big enough. There's no way they can save that industry.
It won't be big enough.
Not even close.
People will get hurt.
Yo, Stanford Stanford has a pay freeze. Stanford has an economic crisis. That's one of the wealthiest institutions in the whole world, in the history of the world. If they're in trouble.
They still got their endowments. They don't want to spend their money. I mean, that's a choice that they're making to, in many cases, hurt their cheapest employees, who they just completely get rid of or furlough and don't pay, while they sit on millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars.
Billions. I think it's like, what's Stanford's endowments, like 40 billion or some crazy thing.
Jeez.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's Harvard. They're comparable. All right, Ben, you're up, and then we're going to go to the private session.
Hi guys, thank you. A question returning to the topic of China. Firstly, Thad, did I hear you correctly when you said you don't agree that China has imperialistic ambitions?
I don't know. I was asking Kmele. He was making the claim, or he sounded like he was making the claim. I don't know. I'm not a sinologist. Isn't that what they're called?
Yes.
Yeah. And I've never, I mean, I follow China as closely as I can, and I've never seen evidence. I've never seen any evidence that they have political imperialist ambitions. They certainly have, I mean, and they're carrying it out, ambitions that are global and economic, no doubt about it. The Belt and Road Initiative is like striking what they're accomplishing. But is that intended, are those roads and bridges intended for tanks, or are they intended for, cargo trucks, right?
I mean, I would certainly say that I don't think it would be, I don't think it's best to describe China as imperialist. I think they want to make the world safe for the CCP. They want to maintain control. Okay. It is worth mentioning that the South China Sea they see as theirs, and anything in it belongs to them. And to the extent there are competing claims, they're willing to destroy anyone who is contesting those claims, and at least to come as close to a potential conflict as possible. So I think it's imperialist, but it's within that narrow region. Everywhere else, they are perfectly happy, it seems, to use their economic power to try and gain influence to, again, make the world safe for the CCP so that it can continue to flourish and exist.
That's a helpful clarification, yeah.
What?
Does that, I mean, would you agree with that, or do you?
Yeah, that was what you both said is a summary of my impression of things. And I was clarifying whether Thad had a strong view to the contrary, which is not the case.
Right.
Yeah, I'm interested, Kmele, if you have any insights from your contacts in Hong Kong about the effect of the virus on the independence movement there currently, and as restrictions start to ease.
Well, the situation there is still incredibly tense. There haven't been nearly the same level of street level protests. Certainly the mass demonstrations aren't happening right now for obvious reasons. But several of the people who I interviewed, actually just before we got on here, I found out a guy that I interviewed was stabbed in a very mysterious event. The government, Beijing, it seems, often through the Hong Kong government or some other factions, has not been shy in some cases about actually dealing out physical violence against members of the protest movement. So that's still something that's happening. Folks are still being arrested who own publications or who otherwise dissatisfy the regime or say things that aren't sufficiently pro-Beijing. So all of those things are very much still going on, and the protest movement is still alive. And the polling that I've seen still suggests that the people of Hong Kong are deeply dissatisfied with their own government, which they see as being completely in the pocket of Beijing. So they're continuing to fight. It continues to be a situation where they have very long odds, but I'm hopeful and optimistic.
Cool. All right. We're going to go to the private session now. So if you're watching this on YouTube and you want to join RU Lives in the future, go to renegadeuniversity.com and become a member at any level. So we're going to stop the recording now, and then we can speak freely, even more freely among ourselves.